Steve Krakauer, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah, Ben, great to talk to you again.
So we've had opportunity to talk over the course of the past several years, and I feel like this period of time has been one of the worst for American political media in general, and of course, Americans' distrust for the media in so many different ways. Why is that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that I was at CNN as late as August of 2013, so less than 10 years ago. I was at CNN, and I think that there were valid criticisms of CNN when I was there, but very clearly by 2015, 2016, certainly into 2017 through the Trump administration, something fundamentally had gotten significantly worse. And we see this in poll after poll. I mean, there's the Gallup poll recently, but every poll that we see, the trust in the media of the American public is at all-time lows, including, I should note, of independence, which I think has just completely fallen off a cliff in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. So something significant has happened. And it really, I write the Fourth Watch newsletter, I write in columns. Those are really kind of quick turn things. I wanted to kind of step back and see and put in the full work of putting it into a book of really trying to figure out, and I laid out 5 specific problems with in-depth case studies exhibiting each of these problems, from a geographic bias to a coziness with power to loosely Twitter, which I think has just completely made everything worse for a variety of reasons. How do we get to this moment in time? And also, I do really think that we are at kind of this inflection point right now also, where the independent upstarts are accruing some power, but there's going to be winners and losers there. That hasn't shaken out. The corporate press is at this very perilous position right now. They're losing their power, but at the same time, we don't know exactly how that's all going to shake out, not just in the media, but in the entertainment space. We're at like this moment in time, and to be able to kind of step back, assess the damage, and then see about potentially some solutions, how we can get back to at least some level of decent press, because I think we do need it. That was really what I set out to do.
You know, what's funny is I'm asked sometimes about the podcasts that I consume because I make references to them. And what I say to people is, I don't listen to political podcasts. I mostly listen to, these different sort of contrarian or centrist or sports podcasts or things like that. And then I realized that like half the podcasts that I listen to are essentially media criticism podcasts. Like Ethan Strauss, it's a media criticism podcast. Like if you get right down to it, Blocked and Reported, the Fifth Column, Megyn Kelly, these are media criticism podcasts that are going down kind of the list of the people who are on your cable news, in your heads, writing these columns and getting it wrong so consistently. It seems to me that this is a boom time for media criticism.
Yeah,
and yet the media itself doesn't ever seem to change.
Right. No, it doesn't. Although the people that you named there, like Blocked and Reported, Ethan Strauss, Fifth Column now, are all Substack based, which is interesting. Megyn Kelly, independent also, but was formerly of the corporate press, now is not. And all of these are places where, I agree. I think there's a lot of media criticism in all those podcasts, and they're all great. At the same time, we have what is traditionally media criticism, or traditionally media coverage, media reporting in more of the more traditional places, the Washington Post and the New York Times and the CNNs of the world, have essentially moved from strict media criticism to really media criticism that's actually just politics masked in this veneer of media criticism. So as they've gotten less, let's just say, trustworthy on the media side, we get these independent upstarts that are much more interested in trying to assess things from a fair, objective perspective. And so I think that we only because of this moment, only because of the loss of power of the corporate media, by people like Megyn Kelly going on the outside and finding success, by these Substack brands being able to accrue an audience and actually gain real power and find influence and find an audience because they're interesting and they're different. That if there's any complaint of where the mainstream press has gone over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, is how predictable everything has gotten, how boring and bland. And you could predict what's going to be said in half or if not more of what you watch on cable news these days. That's a huge problem, and it opens this lane. And I am generally optimistic. I do think that they're starting to notice. I think that they're starting to feel that there's this panic, and now how do we get out of it? And maybe that is by opening a little bit into other areas that they're not being served right now.
You're going to talk to my colleague Howard Kurtz, and obviously I love Media Buzz, but I always joke with Howard. You realize you could do this show not just every day of the week, but probably twice a day, every day of the week. Just the amount of material, the amount of terrible media coverage, of warped media coverage, of inaccurate media coverage, and also of insulting media coverage is so great that people have just, they've turned away from it. They've turned to all these alternate sources. And at the same time, these old guard media entities are basically criticizing these new sources as being dangerous in different respects. So we have the criticism of the siloization of Substack. We have the criticism of, podcasts that has really emerged in the past couple of years that, we can't monitor these the same way that we could,
right.
Print media and the like. Tell me a little bit about the media consumption pattern of the American people. How is that actually changing over time in terms of the way that they're engaging with things as the viewership has declined for cable news and the type of traditional news outlets that we've seen, so dominant in the past?
Absolutely. I think that's really important point. One of the case studies I write about in the book is ESPN. And, I don't traditionally cover the sports media myself, but I think it's a good case study because it represents something. ESPN had a business model that they're going to maybe have some good years and a little bit less good years, but it's steady. They're going to be just printing money forever. That was how it was for a very long time. And then suddenly, a little bit at a time, and then very rapidly, ESPN could be amazing, CNN could be amazing still, and every single day they will lose traditional viewers because of the way people consume content is just completely changing. The amount of options for how you can consume content, for the content you can consume, is growing every single day. You mentioned some of these like podcasts or the way that YouTube shows have taken off or Substack. I mean, all of these outlets are just social media in general. All of these are really starting to impede on the cultural cachet of these once great and still great, but slipping organizations. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that what you mentioned there about the clamping down on quote unquote misinformation or disinformation is a response to this. I describe it in the book as anti-speech activism. We had journalists who, in theory, this is the one occupation where freedom of speech and a free-flowing exchange of ideas, that should be paramount. That's really, I can get why maybe activists or maybe people that are not in the media space might not think this way, but journalists, that's where the bread and butter is. Not anymore. No, whether it's through COVID or through other storylines that I lay out in the book, all of these are examples of, instead of just letting you, the average American, consume a wide variety of opinion, make up your own mind, be privy to different information, we need to make sure that you don't even see it because we don't trust you enough to do, and we don't even necessarily trust you with the truth in some cases. We have to stop it before it can get out there. And that's something that's actually gotten worse since Donald Trump left office. And I think it's actually far more, really concerning because that's not political. This is not a political situation. This is a major distrust in the American public. And of course, the public feels that. And then in response, distrusts the people who are clamping down on them getting more information.
Talk to me a little bit about the profit factors here. Obviously, when it comes to Substack and things like that, you are, or Patreon, let's say, for people who use that for their podcast support, you are giving money to an individual or to a group of people whose content you like and you want to support. Oftentimes, this runs the equivalent of what you used to pay for, let's say, a full magazine subscription, $50,
right.
$60 a year, something like that. Just because, whether you like the Fifth Column or you like, Blocked and Reported, or you liked, House of Strauss, or you like, Shane Gillis and his pothead friend Matt, you are giving them this money, in exchange for consuming extra content or something along those lines. That's not something that, to me, seems like a model that can really expand all that easily, because people just run out of money. They only are going to spend so much money for so much media. And they're in the same way that like streaming services are all clambering over each other to try to get access to you. And you're trying to choose between, okay, how much money am I spending every month for these different streaming services, for shows that I'm not going to watch, or, movies I'm not going to consume? It becomes something that's really difficult to navigate. How does that play out in the future? Like, what is the path forward for this type of new reality where we're essentially paying for columnists or the equivalent of them, that in a way that we used to pay for entire newspapers or magazines?
Yeah, individual people, individual brands. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to document this and uncover it, is because I do think that we are in this particular moment, it's going to change. Because you're right, there's a bundling, if you will, of like Disney Plus and then ESPN and then Hulu. Well, now all of a sudden we're starting to talk like the olden days of it's like a cable subscription. This is where things are going. And so I think that there's got to be a tipping point at some point also, right? There's only so much to go around. And it's not like you go and you subscribe to Substack. You're buying an individual person's content, whatever that may be. And so I think that there's a space for the premium side of the media, which are these subscriptions. And then there is a space for loosely institutional press, for larger media outlets to try to fold in some of these voices and make them more accessible, and in some cases free. It's a different business model where you can invite them into it. I interviewed Brian Stelter about the book, and one of the things that he said is that CNN Plus was trying to get Barry Weiss to do a pilot. He thought that was a good idea, and I thought that was interesting. Barry Weiss can still have her Substack, but at the same time, CNN can benefit from the cachet of having someone like Barry Weiss under their umbrella. It could be mutually beneficial. It can build an outside brand and the financial streams on the independent side. And for a large media outlet, it can get that cultural cachet also from sort of the outside or that more heterodox point of view. I think that that's one area where this could work. What does it look like for a Glenn Greenwald not just to have a Rumble show and to have a Substack, but to also in some way be integrated into a more traditional, larger media outlet that in some ways also can help? I mean, this is something I talk about in the book where, it's one thing for an independent person to go after someone like a Harvey Weinstein or a Jeffrey Epstein, but you don't have the legal resources or the financial backing of large media outlets. It makes that job harder. So we need some sort of official or unofficial partnership, I believe, in order to solve this problem, not just for the audience, but for the businesses themselves.
You obviously had the opportunity to interview some of the people who are at the center of all of these discussions and ask them a ton of questions. One of the things I'm curious about is, did you ask them and what did you learn about their own media consumption habits? Meaning, are they essentially reading all the same things, or were you impressed or surprised by people who maybe went out of the normal loop, went out of the normal silo in terms of the way that they consumed media?
Yeah, I think one of the most notable aspects of it, and it's something that you sort of like chuckle about, but the fact that it happened in so many interviews, and really not just the people that I talked to on the record, but people that I just talked to on an everyday basis off the record that are in the media industry, is the real very rare case is when you talk to someone who consumes content outside of Twitter. And in comparison, how many people spend so much time on Twitter and regret it? Oh, I'm as guilty as this as anyone. But so many, the chapter that I have on Twitter is chapter 11, and the reason it's just so full of quotes, all 15, 20 people on the record about it, is because everyone seemed to have something to say about it. And part of that was the idea that they themselves were finding it very difficult to consume their own content, their own daily consumption habits, have that happen outside of the Twitter, sphere that they've crafted for themselves. They acknowledge, it's just this bubble and it's just everyone talking to themselves, and I can't get myself off of it. And I feel that same way also. And so I think that it's become not important in the sense of that it's this great business or that there's more and more people joining about it. It's just the opposite. But there is a real, it has a positive and a negative factor on the way our press operates these days, because everyone, it seems, in the industry spends so much of their time on that platform talking to each other and reading and consuming content from there as well.
I'll confess my own opinion on this, which is that I work from a desk at my home most of the day, and I have my laptop open, and I don't have Twitter logged in or anything on my laptop. So from my perspective, like, my Twitter time is when I'm out and about or I'm doing other things. Like, in other words, it's meant to be ephemeral. It's meant to be snacking. Right. Because if I had Twitter on my laptop, I'm sure that it would distract me from writing anything. I would dive into things and I would be, engaging with it in that way. And I just think it's not good to have any kind of sort of feed like that is interrupting your thoughts constantly. It's good to plug your phone in and put it out of reach of where you are so that you can actually interact and think about deeper things. That's my own opinion personally.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I mean, and even even separate from how much time is spent on there, it's the feeling that you get from it. I mean, if you have a tweet that goes viral, maybe a couple hundred people or a couple thousand people are retweeting it or giving you positive affirmation, it can feel like a drug. And I think I talked to Sharon Waxman in the book, who owns The Wrap, about how some of her own reporters, she's seen the response from Twitter, even in the negative sense, all of a sudden you get 50 people yelling at you, that can feel like the walls are closing in, and it can affect the way you cover things in the future, or if you cover them at all. So it has also an actual effect on the way journalists do their jobs, whether it's positive or negative, the feedback that they get on a platform like Twitter.
Let me talk about another aspect of this that obviously you get into in the book, which is geography. There's a very common thing that I've heard over the years, which is that the press is essentially biased based on a number of different factors that don't actually have to do with ideology. They have to do with the background of their experience based on their geographic point of origin, and because few of them come from the American working class communities or communities in the South or in the Midwest, that they're likely to have more coastal visions of the way that America ought to work, et cetera, et cetera. How big of a factor is geography really when assessing the media bias related issues and, frankly, the kind of blinkering of their inability to understand the importance of certain issues when it comes to our press?
I think it's huge. I think it's a major element here. And it shows up in large ways, but also in small ways. I write about one moment. I think COVID was a huge example of this in the way that not only our journalists don't really spend a lot of time outside of New York and DC to begin with. Now they're isolated, locked down in their apartments rather than, and certainly not going out into the world. And you get this idea, this warped idea of the blue state versus red state in how you deal with COVID. There was a graphic that Meet the Press put up when it was describing what was being done in states like Texas, where I live, when it came to masks in schools. And the graphic said, masks banned in these states in schools. And it had something like Texas. And the truth is that masks were never banned in anywhere in Texas. Mask mandates were banned. And to be honest, school districts like Dallas that I'm in actually went against this ban, and there was never any fight. And so they still have their mask mandate ban. So the idea, though, I believe that whoever made that graphic and whoever saw it and the editors, everyone actually thought that kids would go to school potentially wearing a mask and be told, nope, masks are banned here. That's not the case. There are kids in my kid's school still wearing masks because that's the parents' choice. The mandates were banned. And it's just a small example of when you don't have any experience with this, when you have this perception about a certain area of the country, your journalist mistakes are going to become even more amplified because you just don't fundamentally understand the people in those places. And to be honest, it really started in the path to getting extremely worse when November of 2016 came around. And the idea in newsrooms was that there was absolutely no chance that Donald Trump could win. And the fact that he won, you would think that maybe would lead them to some introspection there. Well, how do we get this so wrong? And there was a little bit of a brief moment of that. Selena Zito I talked to for the book, she was hired by CNN in theory because of that. She describes how she was interviewed in front of the entire organization about what they may have missed. That was when she first got started. Within weeks, she was off the air. And then she just sat sidelined for the entire length of her contract at CNN because they didn't want that perspective anymore. No, suddenly they turned against not just Donald Trump, but the people that voted for him also. And so the geographic bias was there to begin with. For a very long time, New York and DC has been the hub of the media, but it's only gotten worse from Trump and then from COVID. And the fact that there is no introspection and no humility in so many of the journalists that we see today is only going to make this a problem that much worse.
You know, I did an interview right before COVID a couple of years ago with Ross Douthat, where I asked him how it felt to be the last conservative hired by the New York Times. And he laughed and he said that wasn't true and that wouldn't be the case. And, you know, and he cited Bret Stephens' existence and Barry Weiss's existence. You can go back and you can listen to that interview. I think it really stands up in terms of my prediction that he really would be the last person that they sort of brought in who represented a full spectrum conservative approach to things. The New York Times was also one of those entities that after the 2016 election, you know, you had several people, including executives, saying, hey, we missed this. You know, we need to maybe consider bringing in new voices. And, you know, briefly they had various opinion voices and the like, you know, come in. The whole Tom Cotton op-ed situation, something that you obviously get into, you know, is of a piece of this. When did the New York Times basically just decide that they're going to be an argument between liberals and leftists?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. The New York Times conservative of today, I would say, is not what you would describe as your. The
New York Times conservative of today is Kristen Sinema.
Yeah. Right. So. Right. Yes. Yeah. The dangerous radical Kristen Sinema. I know.
Yeah.
It seems like they were just another example of the way that there was this introspection potentially right after the 2016 election, and then that quickly turned into a disdain for the kinds of people that would cause this terrible threat to democracy and to the existence of journalism, this existential threat that they were fighting against. And, you know, legitimately, I think lots of people in these newsrooms actually believed suddenly that introspection was gone. And, you know, I write about in the book what I describe as the temperature test, which is, I use it as, let's say you're watching a weather report for an area that you're not familiar with. And you're watching it and you're just outside and you know generally what temperature feels like, but you don't know, it's a new place. And if the weatherman says something, a number that's 5 degrees one way or the other, you might say, oh, okay, well, maybe that person's right. I know I'm new here. But if that weather guy says something that's 20, 30, 50 degrees different than what you actually feel, suddenly what you feel the temperature is, you're even stronger about. And that guy is not just wrong. Maybe he's lying to you. And then he's not just lying to you about this. What else is he lying to you about? And so I actually think that that's where we're at. It's such a warped coverage, not just of opinion, but of what they say is the truth and the news and the only amount of information that you're allowed to consume, that the general public has turned against the media in such a large way because of that, and has caused real problems for the press. And it's caused it where now suddenly when the media does get things right, or when the media is saying something that's true, there's this instinct, this knee-jerk instinct to say, no, you know, that can't be true because you've lied to me in the past. And now it's even harder for the media to get back on the good graces of, again, not even partisans, not even a hardcore Republicans, but just the average apolitical independent who's just trying to get the news. They just have this loss of trust now. The New York Times to CNN, it's really just reverberated across the entire industry.
I'm sure that you've probably been reading the reporting from Gabe Kaminsky at the Washington Examiner about this blacklist that was created at the behest of an entity, a British entity, in fact, that was funded in part by the State Department, which has become a real item of reporting on the part of Microsoft. They've said that they are disconnecting or not using that type of frame within the ad referral service that they own. And there are also calls for congressional oversight hearings from a number of key members of Congress. The State Department has said that they're not going to fund this anymore. There's a bunch of different, sort of questions about how this ever happened. Talk to me a little bit about that type of taxpayer-funded censorship that we've seen, because it really does seem to be pretty concerning, especially when you consider that there were sites, not just, I think people could sort of say, well, if there's a conservative blacklist, maybe it's going to include places like, The Blaze or Newsmax or something like that. But I think they'd be surprised to see it also include places like Reason or Real Clear Politics, which it did. Tell me a little bit about what's going on there and how we can make sure that that type of thing doesn't happen in the future, especially at the behest of taxpayers.
Yeah, Reason Magazine for free minds, free markets. Yes, we must censor that. That's where we.
One of the top 10 most dangerous places, according to the Global Disinformation Index. So
it's really alarming, and I'm honestly like, we should really be alarmed about this, but we also should be at least a little bit thankful that these kinds of things become public, and we see this overreach with Reason Magazine, for example, and then because that's just so absurd and so over the line, it gets pushed back, and the State Department says they're not funding it anymore. I think about this with that disinformation board that was started with the Broadway singing lead.
Yes.
We should be thankful that she was the one who was put in charge of it and not just an average bureaucrat in the Democratic Party, because it was so ridiculous and so over the top that they had to disband that thing. They didn't want to disband that thing because the concept of having a disinformation board is they've rethought it, and no, actually that's probably not the area that the government should be involved in. No, they disbanded it because it got some bad press because they picked a ridiculous person to head it. So we've gotten lucky that these things have not snowballed in the way that they have so far, but this is where it's going. And the fact that the corporate media, the fact that the media themselves, from the way that the Hunter Biden laptop story was handled, and not just the fact that it was suppressed, but the fact that there was not universal outrage of the way that Twitter treated the New York Post, making that link no longer accessible. Instead, what happened is Maggie Haberman sends a link to the New York Post and is dubbed MAGA Haberman by her own colleagues. Mm-hmm. That should show us where we are as the press. And the press is not as outraged as they should be. The general public, the general, person in the press is not as outraged as they should be about these overreaches that are happening on the government side, because they too, in many cases, share the same belief that quote unquote misinformation and disinformation is this dangerous thing that must be quelled. I wrote in The Hill in 2021, when this whole misinformation thing was even bubbling up more, that in defense of misinformation, and look, I'm not a fan of actual misinformation. I don't want misinformation out there. I'd rather it be true. But I've described it as that misinformation is the tax we pay for freedom. We don't want more misinformation out there, but I would rather more freedom than government overreach, than censorship. And so along with the rest of the free-flowing ideas, we are lucky that we get to live in a time where we can weed out the few things that are untrue. And I trust that the market will weed them out. That is not what we get right now from our government. That's not what we get from the people that are in charge on the tech side. Obviously, Elon Musk is changing that. And it's certainly not what we're getting from the media. And that sort of collusion that's happening, that soft collusion, is really concerning.
A final question for you, and maybe this is something that's a little too ideologically specific for you to have an opinion on, but I'm curious as to it. I'm drinking right now from a National Journalism Center mug, which is an entity that I've spoken to before. You have the Young Americans for Freedom. You have the Fund for American Studies. You have the Novak Fellowships that are underneath them. You have all these different nonprofit entities on the right that are meant to produce or intended to produce right of center journalists. They don't need to be, harshly conservative. They don't need to be opinionated. They just want to produce journalists who come from a conservative background and give them the opportunity to succeed. I've seen, a number of different programs along these lines at Hillsdale, at Patrick Henry College, and the like. And one of the things that's true of them is that they produce a lot of people who turn out to be, very successful within the media environment, but perhaps not very conservative. People might be surprised that Jonathan Martin, formerly of the New York Times and now Politico, was a graduate of one of these programs. That Tim Alberta, someone who's been, a vociferous critic of the right, is somebody who also was a graduate of one of these programs, got a bunch of grant money to write his book. Robert Costa, obviously, very prominent, journalist, also came through this program. The joke among my friends is that the right and its donor class has spent millions of dollars giving people the imprimatur of a kind of right of center or centrist journalistic background that they then use to go and attack the right over and over and over again. Dave Weigel is another example of this. How can the right be better at producing quality journalists who still maintain their kind of connection to the conservative communities, backgrounds, colleges, experiences that they have, and in the interests of using a Trump framing of this, does the conservative journalism industry need to shut down until it figures out what the hell is going on?
Yeah, it's an interesting predicament, and I do think that the idea of how do you stay true to the communities that you potentially came out of, culture that you came out of, even more so than ideology, even than becoming a conservative journalist, even if you just stay as a journalist, but you don't then turn sort of the opposite direction into a disdain of maybe the people that got you there. That would be much more preferable. And I don't know let's say, backgrounds of some of the people that you named who have gone on to great careers in the corporate press. But I do think that it starts not just on the ideologically right side, but just in general of trying to find people who have to be almost dragged into journalism. People that don't, if we're getting people that are graduating from the top journalism colleges and want to essentially become stars because that's what journalists can be these days, influencers, then you're picking from the wrong pool of people. You need to find people who are curious, who do, in some cases don't have a journalism degree or a degree at all. People that come from communities that have a curiosity, that don't disdain the people that they are coming from and the communities that they come from, and are going to be immune from what they may be getting on places like Twitter and other outlets that will try to change them and change the way that they will approach stories. They need to have thick skins, which is a thing that journalists used to have. That was like a prerequisite of journalists. Now they've just the skin.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean it's just completely ridiculous. So I think it's part of it is pulling from the wrong pool of people. Find people that you think have some journalistic traits, but may not even want to be journalists because of what they think journalism is these days. Those are the people that are going to do great work and change the industry for the better.
I want to thank you, Steve. I think this is an excellent book. Obviously, I think it's something that is worthwhile and very good at a description of the media in its point of major transition, which is what I think we are seeing happen in front of our eyes. Thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks, Ben. Always great talking to you.